Hello. This is Tales of Dread. I've put together a list of some of the most mysterious, disturbing, and scary things that have happened in national parks, such as missing people, paranormal events, and reports from witnesses. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and hit the bell icon before we start. This is over 2 hours of strange things happening in our own national parks. Joel Thomas, age 31, of Donaire, started a hike on September 6 from the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir all the way to Lake Eleanor, which is about 9 miles or 14 kilometers away for those not in the United States. And he had planned to go back to the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir on September 9th, which was only about 3 days away. The next day, Saturday, he was reported missing, and Yosemite National Park officials put out a statement that said these things and gave a general description of him. He was about 5 feet 10 inches tall, had brown hair cut short, and was last seen in a red inflatable kayak with a yellow and gray backpack, a green sleeping bag, a blue and green hammock, and a yellow and gray backpack. They strongly asked anyone who has been near Miguel Meadow Lake Eleanor or the trails around the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir to tell the authorities if they know where he is. Once the search started, Yosemite Search and Rescue couldn't find any sign of him at all. Amanda Thomas his wife, wrote on Facebook on a Sunday after he was reported missing that at least 60 National Park Service search and rescue crew members and their dogs were looking for him. Even the whole county of Ptolemy joined the search and rescue mission to find him. They brought equipment, helicopters, kayaks, and boats to try to figure out the general area of where he was last seen in the hopes of finding some sign of him. But as of the year 2022, there is still no sign of Joel Thomason. Is it possible that, like so many other hikers who have gone missing in national parks, he was killed or taken by something? Could he have fallen through a crack or off a cliff? It's possible that will happen. But don't you think that with all of these experienced searchers and an outdoor caravan looking for him, they would at least find a sign of him? It doesn't make sense that so many of these hikers just vanished without a trace. And the path he was taking from the Hetch Hetchy to Eleanor isn't exactly off the beaten path. In fact, all of the trails in Yosemite National Park are well used, with people coming and going all the time. So it's not like he just went off by himself into the deep woods with no idea where he was going. This makes his disappearance even stranger, since tens of thousands of people just like him just vanish without a trace. I'm really interested in what you guys think. Could dragons live in the ground under Yellowstone? Geysers are one of the most well-known places in Yellowstone National Park. About 500 geysers can be found within its borders, making it the place on Earth with the most active geysers. This is about half of all the geysers that are known to exist, and they are caused by geothermal activity. Yellowstone powers a lot of other places, like hot springs and boiling pools of mud. When early settlers felt the intense heat and huge clouds of steam coming from these same places, they made up stories about scary reptilian beasts with long tails. These places have names like Dragon's Mouth Spring and Black Dragon Cauldron, but dragons might not be as mythical as we might think, especially in Yellowstone National Park. You see, on July 30, 1886, the Pioneer Press in Cinnabar, Montana, sent a surprising story to the Alexandria Gazette in Virginia. The story said that 2 tourists hired a stagecoach driver to take them through Yellowstone. Along the way, they were shocked to see a huge shape about 30 feet long moving through some tall grass near Yellowstone Lake. The tour guide said it looked like a huge reptile and was so tall that its head was 10 to 15 feet above the ground, hanging from a long neck. The beast made a scary hissing sound. The tourist told the park officials right away what they had seen, and a search party was put together to go after the beast overnight. So far, the Alexandria Gazette says that Colonel David W. A group of hunters is led deep into the wilderness by the park's superintendent and his assistant, a park guide named Captain Jack Barronett. They made their way to Yellowstone Lake, where they found a cave next to a geyser that no longer erupted. Now, the men are said to have heard the sneaky hiss just before a large reptilian head jumped out of the cave and stretched at least 15 feet past the entrance before quickly pulling back. It's easy and maybe even smart to look at a story like this through the lens of the lack of journalistic standards of the time. There was nothing wrong with newspapers making up lies to sell more copies. Also, it doesn't look like there was any kind of follow-up to this great story. Now, a huge number of hunters would have come to Yellowstone to try to catch the creature if they had found out about it. But a researcher named John LeMay looked into the details of this story from 1886 and found many things that made it more likely to be true. You can see that both Ware and Barronett were real names of people who worked in Yellowstone National Park at this time. In 1871, Barronett built and ran the first bridge across the Yellowstone River. In his honor, a mountain was named Barronett Peak. David W. Ware, on the other hand, was the park superintendent at the time, and was known to be a very honest person. He went on to become a U.S. congressman. You may feel differently about whether or not Congress members are honest today, but that's not the point. Scientists might one day find the bones of a dinosaur in the deepest part of a cave in Yellowstone National Park that has been forgotten for a long time, and say that the bones are too new to be fossils. Because until then, we don't know if the dragon in Yellowstone was real or not. Spencer and his girlfriend at the time went hiking and camping in the Great Smoky Mountains National Forest near Lynn Camp Falls. It is a long, narrow valley with a stream running through the middle. On either side of the stream are wooded hills that rise sharply to meet the ridgeline. The park's edge is at the far end of the valley, where a small cascade leads the stream out of the valley. On both sides of the stream, there are several picnic areas and a few small hiking trails that lead into the woods. On this particular night, they set up their tent in a picnic area on the west side of the stream that wasn't being used by anyone else. This was the most remote place in this section. It was about 10:05 at night. When they heard the first howl, they had just finished dinner. Spencer will never forget that sound as long as he lives. It was a long, sad wail that seemed to come from everywhere at the same time. Nothing else was like it. Spencer and the girl he was dating at the time had never heard of it before. The howl seemed to resonate in his chest, and he could feel the vibrations and deep bass tones in his chest more than in his ears, if that makes sense. His girlfriend at the time looked at him and told him, "We need to go into the tent." A voice told him that she was terrified, so he tried to calm her down. They did it right away. The howl seemed too loud for any animal they had heard before. It was the same as if you had heard a person's voice boosted through a bullhorn. The house looked like it was right outside the tent, but neither Spencer nor his girlfriend could figure out where it came from. It was too loud and deep to be a coyote, and they had never heard anything like it before or since. They heard something heavy moving around outside their tent that night. His girlfriend at the time started to freak out because she thought it was a big black bear, but Spencer told her that bears don't make noises like that. He went outside with a flashlight and didn't find any tracks around his tent, but he could still hear it moving around in the nearby brush. Whatever it was, it knew they were there and seemed to be playing with Spencer and his girlfriend in a way that a predator would. The smell then hits Spencer. He says it smells like rotting flesh and sulfur. It smelled as bad as anything he had ever smelled. He says it was so bad that it burned his nose and made him gag. The smells seemed to be strongest on the east side of the tent, but he couldn't figure out where they came from. Spencer admits that at the time, he was feeling pretty brave with his Glock 19 and a bullet chamber ready to go as he looked for signs of life with his flashlight. His light shone on a big shadow in the brush right next to him. As soon as the light hit the shadow, it jumped up and turned to look at him, as if he had scared something and made it visible. And he's not joking. He ran straight for the tent because his body told him to. It was as if he knew that whatever it was wasn't human, and he had to get away. His girlfriend looks at him like he's crazy as he climbs back into the tent. He didn't tell her what he saw because he didn't want her to be more scared than Sherry was. Now he was scared. He was waiting for what was going to happen next with the tent closed and his hands on his Glock and flashlight. Even the crickets and other night sounds stopped, and all they could hear was something really big and heavy moving around in the brush all around their tent. And this kept going on for hours. But in the end, it went away and never came back. Spencer has told me he's had other strange things happen to him in the woods. But this one still stands out as the strangest and scariest. Whatever it was, it seemed to know they were there and play with them. This is what he learned from it. Spencer and his girlfriend at the time didn't hear it again, but neither of them could sleep, because they were so scared. When morning came the next day, they quickly packed up and left as soon as they could. They didn't go back to the park for a long time. The tent and all the other gear from that trip are still with them. But this one will stick with them forever. And the smell, says Spencer, will always be with him. Even roadkill in Tennessee in the middle of a hot summer will not smell as bad as that. And Tufay National Forest, which was started on July 1, 1915, by the United States Forest Service. The highest peak in the Pecos Wilderness is at an elevation of 13,000 feet. Here are those strange wooden structures that no one can explain. Some of the structures look like they could be used as shelter, like simple teepees. Others look like solid wood cones that have been popping up all over the wilderness. There are reports that each of these is made of more than 1,000 pieces of wood from fallen trees and tree limbs. Some of these pieces are over 20 feet tall and have a diameter of 12 feet. No one knows who is building these structures, why they are being built, or even how they are being built. This is because the big pieces probably need some kind of machine to move them into place. Now, many workers are protesting against these structures, saying that they could start or spread forest fires. Many authorities are also very worried about the fire risks these structures pose and how stable they are. They think that if these buildings fell or collapsed while people were nearby, serious injuries could happen. People have also said that if they are caught building these, they could get a fine of up to $5,000 or go to jail for up to 6 months. It's taken so seriously that crews will work hard to take down the structures, but it seems like they're built just as quickly as they're taken down. There are many theories about what these structures are and why they're being built, but the most popular one is that they're the work of a cult that uses them for ceremonies. Sambi Dubau went missing in Mount Rainier National Park in Washington state on October 9, 2020. He was only 33 years old. He was in great shape and set on going on this solo hike that he had been looking forward to. Most people expected him to be back the next day, since you shouldn't be gone for days at a time on this trail loop. Sam was even seen on the Mother Mountain Trail loop that day. So he was happy, alive, and in good health. But then day turned into night and night back into day, and before you knew it, no one had heard from Sam at all. In the end, Sam was officially reported missing on October 12, 2020. Mount Rainier is thought to be one of the most dangerous places to hike alone, and this is partly because of a few things. One reason is that there is a high chance of a volcano erupting. Another is that there have been a lot of hiking deaths, which can be caused by accidents, icy slopes that people fall down and die on, foul play, and all the other ways that people go missing or die. It's just that there aren't many people there, which makes it a dangerous national park to explore by yourself, but Samuel knew this and was ready for it. He had a phone and a lot of other tools with him. He had a tent for the night. I mean that this man wasn't a beginner. He had been hiking alone for a long time. In fact, this wasn't even his first time hiking alone. So too many. It was strange and surprising that there were no sandwiches. Mount Rainier, a stratovolcano in the Cascade Range of the Pacific Northwest, has a peak that is over 14,000 feet high, and is also called Tacoma by some. Who would have thought? Mount Rainier is actually in Mount Rainier National Park, which is about 60 miles south of Seattle. It is the tallest mountain in both Washington state and the Cascade Range. Sam Duval was not only a big fan of hiking, but also a very smart college graduate. He has a PhD in medical anthropology, which he got from UC Berkeley in 2018. He was a man of logic, reason, and intelligence, and because of this, he had started to teach at Washington State University's anthropology department, starting in June 2020. Everyone he had worked with, including his co-workers, students, and friends, all said he was a very smart, quick-witted, intellectual man who loved the outdoors. Mount Rainier Park rangers who worked in search and rescue for Sam looked all over the mountain for 9 days but couldn't find any sign that Sam had ever been there. Not only did hikers and volunteers search on foot, but they also used helicopters to look around the entire trail. He was last seen while people were searching for him in subalpine meadows, dense pine forests, rocky areas, and even bodies of water. At this point, Sam was thought to be dead. Unfortunately, these search winter storms started raging through the area soon after, causing the temperature to drop dramatically. Even though so many people have been looking for Sam, he has still not been found. Park rangers in Michigan can explain the mysteries, strange disappearances, and strange things that happen around the Lake Michigan Triangle that seem almost supernatural. In fact, in February 1978, a man named Stephen Kibatsky mysteriously disappeared under strange and strangely strange circumstances. But the way he got better was even stranger than you could imagine. Stephen, who was about 23 years old at the time, was busy going to school at Hope College, a small Christian school on the southeast side of Lake Michigan. By most people's standards, he was a pretty normal guy. He was very independent, very smart, and went missing like many other people have in the past. He was a big fan of backcountry hiking and had climbed mountains. This guy was a huge fan of the outdoors in general, which is why they met out in the wild. He was skiing back and forth in Lake Michigan. He only planned to be gone for maybe a day, but when he didn't come back, his friends and family knew something was wrong. Snowmobilers in Saugatuck found his abandoned cross-country skis and a back that was thought to belong to Kibaki. The authorities were then notified because they had just heard that he had gone missing. It didn't take them long to figure out what was going on. So, it was clear that these items belonged to Kibaki. When they went to look into it, they found tracks that went over 200 yards and went past the edge of Lake Michigan. So, it was decided, or at least thought, that he must have walked into the water and fallen through a hole in the ice, killing himself in the cold water below. Even though that was the theory most people agreed on about what happened to Kibaki, it did not mean that his search was over. After several days of searching on land and in the air, they couldn't find any evidence that Kibaki was still alive and well. It was as if he had just vanished into thin air. After a while, all hope was lost, and it was just said that Stephen had vanished and was gone. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Our hero, Stephen Kibaki, wakes up on May 5, 1979, on a grassy knoll just outside of Pittsfield, Massachusetts. There's grass and flowers all around him, and the sun is out. It is the middle of spring, and he wakes up fully aware of himself and where he is. Not only does he not know where he is, but he is also wearing a completely different outfit than he remembers from before. He has a brand new pair of sunglasses, a brand new pair of shoes, and a backpack full of strange hiking and hitchhiking gear that doesn't belong to him, but that he somehow got. He even had a shirt from a marathon he said he ran in Wisconsin, and other things that made him think he had been to Chicago, Utah, and San Francisco. He was completely shocked by all of this. He found a way to hitchhike to the nearest town, which was Pittsfield, where he was able to buy a newspaper with the date on it, which was May 5, 1979. He was shocked and couldn't figure out where the last 14.5 months of his life had gone. He couldn't explain it either. Strangely, Stephen remembers everything very clearly up until the point where he lost consciousness, and then he remembers waking up on this grassy hill. Pittsfield, Massachusetts is more than 700 miles away from where he was last seen. And as soon as he could, he went to stay with his aunt in Great Barrington, which is about 20 miles away from Pittsfield, where he is now. So he found a way to get from Pittsfield to his aunt's house, where he met up with family members he hadn't seen in a long time. Obviously, after he was found, or after he found himself, I guess you could say. He was asked what happened by reporters and his family. Where did you go? How have you been gone for 14.5 months and no one knows where you are? And he had no reason why. In fact, the only thing he could remember was slogging through the snow because he was afraid of nightfall and the cold. So he sat down and rested. The last thing he could really remember or figure out was that he must have passed out from being too cold or too tired. After that, he has no idea what happened. No one knows how this man mysteriously went over 700 miles east and came back with a whole new wardrobe, new shoes, new sunglasses, and other new gear. In fact, this made Kibaki so confused. He even told reporters he was going to go back and try to find out as much as possible. What happened and why it did. One very interesting theory about this case is that he was somehow affected by the Lake Michigan Triangle. Now, if you haven't heard of the Lake Michigan Triangle, it's a lot like the Bermuda Triangle, where strange things have happened in the past, like ships and people going missing. People see ghosts and all kinds of strange things happen. This next story was sent in by a park ranger who didn't want to be named but wanted to be called Stephen at this time. In 2011, he was making his nightly rounds and patrolling the Yosemite Valley. It was around 11:10 p.m. and he remembers this clearly because the picture on the dashboard stands out in his mind. He was driving on a road called Northside Drive at the time. He saw what looked like a man or figure moving across a field to his right. He thought it might be a hiker or camper who needed help and was trying to wave his truck down. He pulls over to get a better look, and as he does, he sees that the figure stands up. When it stood up, Stephen was horrified by what he saw, because it wasn't just a person walking toward his truck, and it wasn't a Bigfoot, either. But the person was hard to describe. Most of the time, if it was a hiker or someone in trouble, you could tell from where he was, which was at most 30 yards away. Stephen didn't see any of these things. Depending on the light, you could see clothes, facial hair, or hair, but he didn't. In fact, he would say it was just a black shadow, but it was clear that it was a person or at least a person. And as he looked, the moonlight could only give him so much light, so he had to squint and study what he was seeing. He said that the figure started to slowly rise into the air and almost glide toward him. Stephen, who was holding his wheel and in complete shock, didn't know what to do or say. He watched as the figure glided about 25 feet and then disappeared. Stephen had no idea what he was looking at or how to understand it. I mean that he was still confused about what he had just seen. He rubbed his eyes and asked himself, did that really just happen? Did I have hallucinations? I didn't get enough sleep. So he quickly goes back to the ranger station, gets himself a cup of coffee, and doesn't tell anyone for a while. He thinks he's gone crazy at this point. Now, one of the most interesting things about Stephen is that he wrote that he had talked to some hikers and tourists in the area the next morning, and they had asked him about a mysterious black figure that was scaring people. In fact, one of the people Stephen talked to was an older man who told him that this person had kept him and his wife awake all night by trying to look into their camper windows and open the door. But whenever they looked, they saw the same dark figure moving around their RV, and they all said the same thing about him. No one said it was a Bigfoot or anything like that. They just saw a dark figure with no clear features or details, which they thought was because there wasn't enough light. Stephen talked to another woman, a mother of 3, who told him a very similar story. She and her kids were up late roasting marshmallows over a fire when one of her kids pointed towards the woods and saw someone standing by a tree watching them. But she said in horror that this thing or person had glowing red eyes and the shape of a man, but it was all black, like a shadow. She told Stephen that she could feel pure evil coming from this person, thing, or whatever it was. She told him that she put the boys in the tent right away and got her gun ready in case anything happened. However, nothing did happen after Stephen checked with the older man and the mother of 3 to confirm the details. This happened about an hour or 2 before he himself saw something in the same area. Which means it's likely that Stephen saw the same shadow person as these other people. At the time, it wasn't clear if anyone else in the area saw the same thing. After Stephen had time to think about what he had seen, these were the only 2 people who could back up what he had seen. He never really told anyone else about it, and he still has trouble talking about it because he's afraid people will think he's crazy. This is part of why he didn't want me to use his real name and asked me to use the name Stephen. So, what do you think about this situation? Is it just a coincidence that 3 different people, including a park ranger, saw the same thing, or was there really a black apparition or shadow person walking around Yosemite National Park that night? Back on March 17, 2012, a man named Derek Luke vanished without a trace in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. "Don't try to follow me," was written on a note that was left on Derek's car. This is an interesting part of his story. Many people already thought that this trip might be a suicide mission, and that he would probably just go into the woods and maybe fall off a cliff. But that didn't stop family, friends, and search and rescue workers from looking for Derek. Park rangers and search and rescue workers knew it would be very hard to find Derek. At this point, no one had heard from Derek in several days. Derek worked as an orderly at the Tennessee-based Peninsula Behavioral Health Center when he went missing. He was around 24 years old at the time. But Derek's disappearance is strange because he just stopped going to work one day, and this went on for a few days. This suggests that he may have killed himself. When his family found out, like any family would, they were very worried. They tried to get in touch with him, but he wouldn't answer the phone or call them back. The family thinks that all of this has to do with the fact that his grandfather, who he was very close to, has gone missing and is likely dead. And it just so happens that Derek went missing on the anniversary of his grandfather's death. This has led many of Derek's close friends and family to think that he probably dropped out because he couldn't handle the death of his grandfather, which is a very common thing for many people to do. At some point, Derek's family found out that he was actually staying at a hotel in North Carolina, but by the time they got there to find him, he had already left. As his family was heading back to Tennessee, they came across his parked car on Newfound Gap Road and called the police right away. The place where he parked his car is right where the Appalachian Trail crosses the Newfound Gap Road. This makes many people think that he just got out of his car and went on the trail to get away. When police and other investigators started to look through his car, they found a note that said, "Don't try to follow me," which backs up the original theory. But many people who work for Great Smoky Mountains National Park were not sure if the note was really Derek's or not. When they looked in Derek's car, they found his wallet full of credit cards, his ID, and a lot of camping gear like sleeping bags, tents, and a map of the park that showed where everything was. Even stranger is that all of the things he had with him were things he had just bought, which suggests he was going to use them for something like hiking or going on a trip. So it doesn't make sense that he would go buy these things and then kill himself. So, even though it's a popular idea, there might be something else going on. At this point, people started asking why he had just walked into the woods in late winter without any gear to help him. And if that's the case, why did he do that? Or could there have been another reason? Another reason that could have been even worse and harder to explain. Maybe he was tricked. We will never know if he ran away from his car out of fear or because someone pointed a gun at him. In fact, this story had gotten so much attention from national media that one of Derek's friends had gone on to talk to CNN and told them that Derek loved the Bear Grylls show Man vs. Wild. Because of this, he could have easily gone on an adventure to show everyone he could do it, clear his head, and try to find some peace in the wild. Even his friend said that Derek wasn't new to the wilderness. He had all the tools, supplies, and knowledge he would need to make it through a trip in the woods. So this made his case even harder to understand. Now, park rangers weren't sure if the gear he had was good enough for the hike. If he was trying to do a track at all, he was doing. Many of the park rangers who were working on Derek's case were not at all sure that the gear he said he brought with him would be enough. They searched over 70 miles of trails and woods near where his car was found, but didn't find anything. And they really tried to go as far as they could in their search. They were rappelling down cliff faces and looking behind it in any cracks or nooks and crannies they could find, but there was no sign of Derek anywhere. Soon, Appalachian Trail hikers were spreading the word to anyone who would listen and was passing through the area, hoping to find a sign of Derek somewhere. But no one had seen Derek anywhere in the Smoky Mountains, even though there were a lot of people going in and out of the park, especially at this time of year when it was warm and sunny. Not long after that, people started to think that he had probably gone off the trail. Whether or not he did that on purpose or not, it would probably be much harder to try to find him. And by March 23rd, there was still no evidence of Derek anywhere else besides his car. And the note and things he had with him. There was no sign of him anywhere. At this point, the search was broken up into smaller groups, so that people could try to stay in more populated areas in the hopes of finding something. What makes this case even more interesting, is that a second man went missing in the Great Smoky Mountains near Newfound Gap on March 18, just days after Derek went missing. He went by the name of Michael Cudicini. He was also from Nashville, Tennessee, and was about 23 years old. And what's strange about him is that he was last seen Sunday afternoon outside of a Walmart. And, just like with Derek, a group of park rangers and other search and rescue workers was put together to look for any sign of this other man. But like Derek, nothing turned up. Unlike Derek's case. But Michael wasn't a huge fan of the outdoors, and he wasn't a hiker or someone who was excited to go to the Smoky Mountains. So, if we skip ahead to the future, we don't know why he actually went out there. On August 21, 2012, searchers found a few things that seemed to match what Michael had been carrying when he was last seen. They thought they belonged to him, and on September 6, 2012, they found pieces of his skull not too far away. The remains found by the county medical examiner's office, in the Knoxville area, will be closely looked at. Came to the conclusion that yes, these are Michael Cudicini's remains. Strangely, his body parts were only found about 3/10 of a mile from where his car was found back in March. Michael Cudicini's body had already been found, but Derek was still nowhere to be found. Even though they didn't know for sure how Michael Cudicini died, there was a lot of speculation that he killed himself out there, and that was the main reason he went to live alone there in the first place. And when the last page of one book is turned, we still don't know what happened to Derek. Derek's case is still open because, according to the National System for Missing and Unidentified People, he just walked off into the woods and never came back. And he has been gone for more than 10 years at this point. Could he have set out to kill himself, or did something even worse happen to him? Did he get scared and run away, then fall off a cliff, get hurt, and be left to die? Or was the note in his car really his, and he left to take care of his own business because he couldn't deal with the death of his close grandfather. I'll let you guys be the judge. This next story was also written by a park ranger who used to work there. Her name is Kit, and from 2014 to 2016, she worked as a volunteer ranger in Yosemite. And while she was there, she saw something very scary that she thought she would never see again. She says it was like something from her nightmares. Her sighting or experience happened in the evening of spring 2015 near Tuolumne Meadows. The evening patrol of the Tuolumne Meadows was given to her and a friend who was also a volunteer ranger. This happened between 8 and 9 at night in the summer. In that spot. It was a beautiful spring evening, and the sun was just peeking over the horizon. There was just enough light left that you didn't have to use your headlights, but you still had to. So she was walking through the fields in their G, and at one point on the road, she and her partner saw movement in a grove of trees right next to the road. This is where it happened, just as they started to slow down because they thought animals were about to cross the road. From the group of trees, this strange animal started to lumber out onto the road. At first, they both thought it was a bear, but as they refocused their eyes and looked at it more, they realized it wasn't a bear. It was huge, at least 5 feet tall when it was on all fours. It had a big head with longish brown hair and yellow eyes that glowed in the light. What they were looking at kind of looked like a bear, but she says Kit says it looks more like a really big wolf, but it's bigger and more pronounced, and it has bigger, sharper teeth that don't belong, she says. As it climbed out onto the path or road, it turned toward them, faced the headlights, and kind of glared at them. Kit says that the animal's front paws were huge and looked more like hands than paws. I mean, this thing looked like a big, misshapen wolf, and some of the fur on its body looked light gray in the light. It also had a narrower waist and looked thinner, but it also had a lot of muscles and looked very strong. She and her partner just stared at it in shock. They both just sat there with their mouths wide open, not knowing how to process what they were seeing. Then, the thing let out a loud howl that scared her and her friend pretty badly. It then slowly backed away from them, still on all fours and looking angry that they had even seen it. Then it stops right as it's pulling off the road, and Kit says that what happens next is something that only happens in nightmares or movies, along with a wet popping sound. It started to stand up on 2 legs like a flipping werewolf, and when it was fully upright, this thing, which was at least 8 feet tall, turned back toward their car one last time and just disappeared into the woods. Kit had been a ranger for at least 2 years, and he had never seen anything like that before or since. Her friend and she still work in Yosemite Park, but they don't talk about it much. They're afraid that people will think they're crazy, like many other rangers who are afraid to speak up. But kids know what she saw, and that it's not something you would normally see. But because her father is white and European, I think she said that she is fully Germanic and that her mother is a mix of several different tribes. She grew up hearing a lot of native stories and legends, so she knows for sure that these creatures exist. Before this night in 1992, she was open to the idea, but she didn't really believe it. Many people would say that Anders Grant had a psycho-spiritual nightmare in the Wasatch National Forest, which is in the mountains east of Salt Lake City. He had to deal with the death of a close friend, an eerie presence, and the fact that he couldn't figure out what had happened that day. The story I'm about to tell you has traumatized the man I'm about to talk about, and he has almost no idea what went on around Anderson. It happened at a campsite in the Bridger Lake National Forest. This is in the Wasatch National Forest, which is part of the United Nations. 2 big hills. This is a big national park just east of Salt Lake City. The campground is right on the border with Wyoming. It is a long way into the Wasatch Mountains, and you can get there by driving up Highway 80 past Evanstone. The drive is gorgeous, and when you get to the Wasatch Mountains, it's almost enough to change your life. If you look at a map, you might think that this is a long way to go just to go camping. But Anders gave it his all. It was worth every penny. Andrews had been there before, but he didn't remember seeing any signs about black bears. Most people think it's safe to go there and be in the middle of nature without worrying about dangerous wild animals. The park is not the same. You have to pay now, and it's full of tourists and ups, and rangers in their big $50,000 RVs hand out tickets. And during the 1990s it was still mostly wild and not too changed. There were no park rangers around, and the only places to sit and eat were on a few picnic benches. There was hardly any sign of people anywhere. It's amazing how much changes in just 20 to 30 years. If you went in the middle of summer, you were also unlikely to see anyone else. There were a few stragglers and backpackers here and there, but they were few and far between. So, here's the story. Anders knew this girl from high school. He went to Weber High School in North Ogden in the late 1980s. When he was 23 and working in Salt Lake, he ran into her by accident and they became friends again. Her name was Pamela, and she met her new best friend at work. Her new best friend's brother, Simon, was gay, according to what she heard. So Pamela started trying psychedelic drugs like acid and shrooms, and she sort of turned into a hippie. Anders had tried smoking weed, but he had never tried mushrooms or any other psychedelics. So she met this guy who became her occasional pot dealer. Back then, it was hard to get mushrooms in Utah. The Grateful Dead and other counterculture bands and groups were still touring, and you usually had to have some kind of hippie concert connection to get them, just like with acid. It's too much trouble to look into these things. So, this dealer, whom Anders had never met before, called Pamela, and told her that Anders had just spent $1,000 on the best mushrooms he had ever tried. He had them all in this big bag. So, one thing led to another, and Anders, Pamela, and the whole group decided to go camping, and take a bunch of mushrooms. Sounds like fun? Well, not quite. The Wasatch Mountains are the best place anyone can think of to do it. I mean, you're away from all forms of authority and it's usually safe to go hiking in the woods. But Anders had never met this guy, so he suggested that maybe they shouldn't take him after all, since none of them really know him. Anders was scared when he thought about the fact that he is, after all, a dealer. Who knows what he might bring with him, but Pamela told him not to worry because he's fine. So, fair enough, I heaved a sigh of relief, and I just took it for what it was. Pamela borrowed her brother's Jeep Cherokee because the roads to the camp can be rough at times. So, she picks up Anders, and one by one, the rest of the group gets in the Jeep. When they finally pick up the dealer, everyone is excited to see this big bag of mushrooms. But this dealer guy only has enough for 3 people because he didn't know that Anders and Simon were coming, so he grumbles and goes back into his house to get more. He doesn't seem to mind. So no one really cared too much. Everyone finally stopped and bought about $40 worth of food and supplies. Now, both Anders and everyone else were getting excited. At this point, it was about 100 miles to Fort Bridger, which they did in less than 2 hours. This trip looked like it was going to be a lot of fun. The campsite was about an hour away after that. During this trip, though, this guy, the dealer, starts to really irritate Anders. He figures out right away that Simon is gay, or at least thinks he is, and starts saying really rude things to him in an attempt to get a reaction, like he's supposed to be funny, but no one thinks he is. It gets old really fast and really ruined the mood for Anders and the rest of the group, by the time they got to the campground. Anders was so sick of the guy that he realized he might have been right when he said they should have just bought the mushrooms and left him behind. But when Anders thinks back on what happened, he thinks that his old girlfriend was just trying to save money. He doesn't know what she was thinking at the time. The dealer had told her that he had a lot of mushrooms and that they should go camping, and she had said yes without even thinking about it. Anders is pretty sure that this dealer guy was just trying to get into Pamela's pants, but that's not the point. So, when they finally got to where they were going to camp, they set up the tent, made a fire for later that night, and did other things. It was a very hot, sunny day, and it was around 1 or 2 p.m. so, most of them are getting used to their new homes. So Anders suggests that they all do the mushrooms right then. So they can go hiking while it's still warm, which will be soon. Everyone seemed to agree with the idea and like it. So everyone ate a lot of shrooms, and Anders remembers that they didn't taste bad at all. He had always thought that shrooms were supposed to make you throw up, but they tasted more earthy and normal. And sure enough, 14 minutes later, they started to feel a little off. This guy, the dealer, had brought a bigger bottle of cheap whiskey, and he starts drinking it with cans of soda that he bought. He offers it to Anders and the rest of the crew, but nobody really wants a drink. Then he starts to get angry, rude, and just a nasty drunk, and things start to go bad. At this point, this dealer guy starts to be mean to Simon and call him names that are rude and disgusting. Anders didn't know Simon very well, but he knew he was a nice, quiet kid who liked to be alone. No one would have trouble with this person, but the poor kid couldn't even stand up for himself. He was pretty shy and didn't talk much. In fact, Anders isn't sure if he was gay or just very shy and awkward. As things start to heat up in the camp, he's not sure what to do. Arguments started to fly back and forth when Simon's sister got really mad, and now everyone was starting to trip and everything felt terrible. And the more Simon's sister defended her brother, the more this guy was encouraged. He was saying things like, "You can't stand up for yourself," and Anders said, "Why are you bothering him?" I mean, this guy was really mean to Simon, but he seemed more interested in getting drunk. So, there was a lot of noise, and everyone was getting angry and arguing. The mood was getting worse and worse, and Simon finally had enough. He got up and stormed off toward the lake. So, now that Simon is gone, this guy starts to calm down, but his sister keeps giving him lectures, which seems to make him feel a lot of shame and guilt. No one says anything for a long time, and it gets really sad. So, they go about their lives and start talking about things. For a while, everything is fine again. After a long time, someone finally asks, "Hey, how long has Simon been gone?" No one was sure how long it had been, but it had been hours at this point. This guy, the drunk drug dealer, seems to have started to feel bad about the damage he caused, so he eventually offered to go find Simon and said, "Don't worry, I'll go find him." Anders says, "I'll go with you," and they both agree with him. And this dealer guy seemed to have changed in some way. So Anders thought that if the rest of the day wasn't good, it would at least be okay. And he got the sense that the guy was upset because Pamela turned him down sexually and was taking it out on Simon because his ego was hurt and Simon was an easy target. As they walked and talked, he got to know this guy better. He didn't seem like a very bad person. So, Anders and dealer finally got to a place where they could start walking down to the lake. There were a lot of thin, tall trees, and everything was open and easy to see. It's so pretty that it's almost unreal. It's definitely God's country, it's majestic. So, they start shouting Simon, Simon, but no one answers. There is a fork in the trail. One path goes to one spot by the lake, and the other, which is probably deer trails, goes to another. They go in different directions. You have your choice. So, Anders and his friend each follow a trail, and Anders tells his friend, "If you don't find him in 5 minutes, I'll meet you back here." They both agree, and then they go their separate ways. Now, Anders has been walking for a long time just yelling Simon's name, but he hasn't heard anything. He's thinking about turning around and going home because he doesn't want to be here anymore. He wasn't having much fun. It was fine, but nothing special, and he wished he had stayed home. At this point, he was trying to shake off his trip, which was getting worse as the psilocybin started to work. All of a sudden, Anders had this overwhelming feeling of fear that just swept over him. Anders stops and stands still because he has a scary feeling that something is telling him not to take another step forward. He doesn't know what it is, but he's afraid to take another step forward and feels like something is watching him, even though he's scared and confused. He wants to shout Simon's name, but he stops himself. He immediately turns around and heads back up the trail in the direction he came from. He notices that the nice sunny weather has started to change, and he can now see dark clouds and feel a chill and wind. It's not unusual for the weather to change quickly in the mountains, after all. Suddenly, he hears a very loud noise that sounds like a machine or something high-pitched whining. It scared Anders. He heard a sound that sounded like it was coming from a giant steel horn loudspeaker. Since they were miles away from any other people, it was a sound that didn't make sense. Anders started to run toward the sound, but he didn't know what it was, so he ran into the smart guy and watched him run up the trail in a panic. It was very slick with lots of small, smooth rocks, and the dealer guy kept stumbling and falling as he rushed up to Anders. It looked like he had seen a ghost or something. This guy, the dealer guy, was freaking out because he knew something terrible was wrong. When the dealer guy got to Anders asked him, "Did you hear that sound?" He just says, "What sound?" But then he says, "There's something wrong with that kid." Now he's clinging to his shirt like a scared child. He's a different person now. Andrews was trying to catch up with him, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get any more information out of him. Finally, Anders said, "Let's go." So, the two of them started walking for a minute until they ran into Simon, who was kneeling right at the edge of the lake. It looks like he's frozen solid with his hands by his sides. The strangest thing is that he's staring up at the sky and covered in what looked like white ash from head to toe, including his hair, face, and clothes. It looked like the grayish-white cement mixture that Anders had used in the past, or a cement mixture that most of us are probably familiar with. Anders and the dealer guy run up to him, and he just looks up with his eyes closed and his mouth wide open, as if he was silently screaming at the sky. Anders grabs his shoulder and yells at him to see if he's okay, but Simon just falls to the ground. He tells the dealer to go get the girls now, so the dealer gets up, runs away, and goes to get them. In the meantime, Anders is doing everything he can to get Simon to talk. Suddenly, he hears the siren again, but this time it sounds like it is right behind him. Anders is freaking out now because he can't see anything through the trees. He tells Simon to get up, get up, get up, because we have to go now, and he's really starting to worry, but Simon doesn't move. Anders tries to pick him up, but he's too heavy, so he puts his arm around his waist to get some leverage and help him stand up. But it didn't work. It's like he's been turned off, because he's not making any sounds and you can't hear him breathe. Anders was really freaking out at this point. After a few minutes, the dealer guy and the two girls, Pamela and Simon's sister, run up. Simon's sister starts freaking out. She is inconsolable. At the time, They didn't know it, but something really bad had happened to Simon again. Anders, Pamela, and everyone else hears the siren, except for the dealer guy. Pamela looks at Anders' horrified face and asks, "What was that?" And Anders tells her, "I don't know, help me get Simon up now." In the meantime, the dealer guy didn't seem to hear the siren. Anders isn't sure if he's just too busy or what, but he has this weird, stunned, disconnected look on his face. He starts talking incoherently about them, pointing to a place near the trees and saying, "That's where they stuck me." Anders has no idea what he's talking about. Anders thought that some teenagers from the country might have been camping up here and making trouble. I mean, he couldn't figure out what this guy was saying or what to think, so they brought Simon back to camp and put him on a picnic bench to try to push through everything. It was almost impossible to move him. At first, he was stiff and awkward, but then he became like a big rag doll, heavy, stiff, floppy, and hard to hold. His sister screamed, cried, and asked, "What did you do to him?" the whole time. Anders shouts back at her, "I didn't do anything." The other guy was pretty much out of it and in a vegetative state where he couldn't move or talk. Anders says that he didn't recognize Pamela, his old girlfriend. Even her clothes and hair looked different, as did the color and length of her hair. Her clothes looked strangely old, like they were from a different time. Simon, on the other hand, was all grayish-white and covered in a mysterious, very fine powder. They didn't get rid of it either. No one knew what any of this stuff was. None of them had ever been so scared in their whole lives. They were all trying to get out of there as fast as they could, but they didn't know that a storm was coming. The sky was dark with clouds, and it was starting to rain and pour down hard. Almost everything was left behind. They left the main park area and went down to the bottom, where there are big trash cans and signs telling everyone to pick up their own trash and throw it away. At this point, the dealer guy points at the bins and starts to open the door to get out. Pamela has to literally hit the brakes to stop him from hurting himself because he's trying to get out and trips over the bins, throwing what's left of his mushrooms into them. Then he gets back in and just stares straight ahead, as if he was still dead. They drive and drive and drive until they reach Fort Bridger, a tiny town that Anders doesn't even think had a police department at the time because it's a real one-horse town. The whole time, they're yelling and shouting at each other and laughing so hard they can't stand it. Simon was starting to look less grey and more white, almost like he was glowing. Anders was so scared of him, that he could hardly even look at him. The person who sold the mushrooms just looked like he was out of it, like the lights were on but no one was home. Anders thinks this guy saw something by the lake, but it was so scary that the dealer guy just shut down mentally. Now, they used a payphone to call 911, but no one was around in this small town. During all the chaos, the guy who had the mushrooms snuck away and was never seen again. Anders just watched him sneak away without saying anything. Anders wasn't sure if this person even knew where he was going. Anders thinks this guy was either high or mentally gone because he just got up and left. He doesn't know where he went. Now, after an hour, the police finally showed up with an ambulance, and Simon was pronounced dead at the scene. When they took him out of the back of the Jeep and he didn't have any white-grey powder on him or anything else strange, his sister pretty much went crazy. They were all just crazy talkers. The police later found the mushrooms in the trash. Anders and Simon's sister didn't get into any trouble, but his old girlfriend Pamela was found guilty of selling Class A drugs and given a 5-year probation. She's lucky that she didn't go to jail. But this mysterious event had messed up their minds completely. Strange things happened after that. Here's where things get even crazier. They don't seem to have had the same kinds of experiences. Simon's sister insists that there was no other drug dealer guy with them when they went camping. No one was mean to Simon, but he liked going off on his own sometimes. But Anders and Pamela, who used to be his girlfriend, remembered the guy well and talked about how bad he was. The police never found this person, or were able to prove that he existed. There were no phone records, and Simon's sister didn't remember getting angry or arguing with anyone that day. The police didn't know what to think, that's all. Pamela said that while they were looking for Simon, a group of Native Americans wearing very old and worn-out tribal clothes wandered through the camp. They had a very serious look. They didn't even look in their direction or say anything as they walked right by them. But 150 miles to the north is the Wind River Reservation, which is mostly made up of Shoshone and Arapaho Indians. Later that day, the police took Pamela back up the mountain, and she showed them where the man had thrown the mushrooms. Later, Simon's sister would say that she was the one who got out of the jeep, put the bags in the trash can, and brought the mushrooms. She insisted that these friends had never picked up a dealer, and Andrews couldn't even remember where the guy lived because he had never been to that huge, sprawling part of South Salt Lake. It was a crazy thing to go through, and he could only think that Pamela took them to her house, but that didn't help him find anything. Anders wasn't high enough to have seen all this stuff in his head. He still thought for himself. He was still here and in the real world enough that he knew what was real and what wasn't. But he hasn't said anything to explain any of this. Later, he heard that Simon had died, but he didn't know why. He stopped living without a clear herbal explanation, and no drugs were found in his body, but everyone remembered that he had eaten mushrooms. Even more, his sister insisted that he had never used mushrooms before or on that day. No grey dust or powder was found on him by anyone. And Simon's sister said that when they looked at each other, she saw a very tall old man in dark clothes walking near the edge of the woods. He stopped and gave her a wave before going over the ridge and out of sight. Anders didn't see anyone else there that day, and Pamela didn't tell him she'd seen the old man, either. So he wants to know what this whole thing was about. Was it just kids taking shrooms and going crazy because of their foolishness and encounters with aliens? Or were they breaking the rules by going into these Native American burial grounds? And if that's the case, why would they want to hurt someone as kind as Simon? What was that horrible siren in a place where there were no people at all? Nothing makes a lot of sense. Could it have been evil spirits, shadow people, a witch in the mountain, or something else supernatural and bad? Did a door to a parallel universe open and let some bad guys in before they went back where they came from? Since 1992, these things keep coming back to him. When it was so bad. If a dragon is hiding in a cave near Yellowstone Lake, it's easy to see how people might not notice it. Yellowstone Lake has 110 miles of shoreline, and is the largest body of water in the park. But a few islands stick up above the water. Stevenson Island, which is about 820 feet wide and just over a mile long, is one of the more important places. Colonel James D. Stevenson was an executive officer with the U.S. Geological Survey, who helped explore Yellowstone National Park in 1871. The island was named after him. During this time, settlers first reached the shore of what would become Stevenson Island. In 1905, a 60,500 passenger steamboat called the Kristen the E.C. Waters started giving tours of Yellowstone Lake. It looked like a good way to make money. Unfortunately, this chance was doomed from the start. The Yellowstone National Park authorities and the steamboat owner were always at odds with each other after customers complained about his attitude and how he treated the animals. He wasn't given a license to run a passenger ferry on EC waters. So, he had no choice but to leave it docked at Stevenson Island until the situation was clearer. Even worse, most of Yellowstone Lake freezes over in the winter, so the boat could only be used reliably from June to November. But in 1906, the owner of the EC waters hired a caretaker to watch over his investment when it wasn't in use. As part of this job, the ship at Stevenson Island had to be checked on occasion. One winter day, the caretaker set out in his rowboat for Stevenson Island, but the work was too much. Rowing was hard enough, but breaking the ice to get to the island gave the caretaker a heart attack, and he died along the way. No one could fix the EC waters, and over the next few months, the steamboat got worse and worse. The owner left it moored at Stevenson Island, where it just rotted away. The wreck was brought to shore in 1921, and over the next few years, it was picked over. The boiler was taken out to heat a hotel, and the rest of it was used as a makeshift shelter for skiers and then as an awning for a fish fry business that was open during the warmer months. It also started having late-night parties where fights were bound to happen. In fact, a fight like this happened in the summer of 1929. A park ranger was enjoying a quiet morning shift when his boss asked him to check on a group of drunk people who had set up camp on Stevenson Island the night before. There were reports of fighting, and the supervisor wanted to make sure that no one was stuck or, even worse, bleeding in the shadow of the sunk steamboat. The morning was warm and sunny, and the ranger hurried to the marina to get one of the official boats used to patrol Yellowstone Lake. During the summer, the trip from the shore to Stevenson Island was short. So, it didn't take long for the ranger to get to the shore. Now, the ranger could see right away that there had been a party. There was trash all over the beach, and some empty beer bottles were bobbing around in the water. As the ranger pulled his boat up to the creaking remains of the steamboats and got off, the wake from the boat shook the glass containers. He had a lot to do, so he started picking up as much trash as he could. Now that this task was done, the ranger looked into the wreck of the EC waters. Luckily, no one from the party the night before seemed to have been left behind. But it was possible that some drunk partygoers had made their way down to the shore. The ranger had to check everything on Stevenson Island, which wasn't very big but would still take some work. By mid-morning, the ranger was no longer in a good mood. His search didn't turn up any stragglers, and all he had to show for it was sweat, exhaustion, and a bad mood, but he was happy that he had looked everywhere. As he got to the top of a small rise, where his patrol boat was waiting, a strong gust of wind almost knocked him off his feet. The air was cold, almost freezing, and the once calm waters of Yellowstone Lake were now a rolling boil of white caps. Now things start to get crazy. This huge, dark thunderhead moved toward Stevenson Island in the sky, and that's when the rangers saw something floating in the shallows that he hadn't seen during his search. It was big and round, like a person. The ranger's heart jumped into his throat when he realized that someone had been there the night before and that time was running out. He fumbled with his radio, getting ready to tell the rescue team that a partygoer had fallen from the wreckage of the steamboat into the water, hit their head on the way down, and might drown. When the rangers called out in a panic, all they heard was a blank hiss of static. He knew he had to do something, so he waded into the shallow water where the body was floating face down. When the ranger got down on his knees, he saw that the clothes on the body didn't look at all modern. Instead, he saw a man who would have been at home in Yellowstone before it became a national park. He looked like a classic explorer or fur trapper in the way he was dressed. Did a ghost appear? Certainly not. The ranger was able to touch the man and see if he had a pulse. He was no more. The ranger turned the body over so that it was on its back and facing up. The scene was horrifying. The blue-white face of a person who had drowned stared at him with bulging brown eyes. The rangers then said so quickly. It happened in the time between breaths. The body was no longer there. Before, the ranger's hands were holding the thick furs of an old jacket. Now, they are holding nothing but empty air. He falls backwards onto the beach and stares at the empty spot as he lies on the sand. The ranger noticed that the scene around him had also changed while he was trying to gather his thoughts. The storm cloud was gone. So was the wind, which left Yellowstone Lake calm. Once again, he didn't feel cold. Instead, the warm sun on his face felt good, as if his body had somehow left him. Suddenly, the ranger looked through the water beyond Stevenson Island, but nothing seemed out of place like before. Now that he was having a panic attack, he tried to figure out what had just happened, but the only things that could explain it were that he had met a ghost or that, by some miracle, he had gone back in time for a short time and seen the aftermath of a tragedy that no one knew about. The ranger ran to his boat, jumped in, and headed back to the mainland in a straight line. Now, the next year, the Park Service decided to stop the drinking parties on Stevenson Island that went late into the night. They had finished. They soaked the wreck of the sea waters in kerosene, leaving behind a charred, whole thing that was still hanging onto the bare mental framework of Hawaii volcanoes. Kilauea, one of the world's most active volcanoes, and Mauna Loa, the world's largest shield volcano, are both in Hawaii National Park, which is a national park in the United States. Scientists can learn about how the Hawaiian Islands changed over time and do research in the park, which is open to the public. The park has amazing vault environments, glimpses of rare plants and animals, and a look at how these scenes are connected to traditional Hawaiian culture. Hawaii National Park opened on August 1, 1916. It was later split into this park and Haleakala National Park. A recognition of how great its natural standards are. In 1980, Hawaii Volcanoes National Park became an International Biosphere Reserve, and in 1987, it became a World Heritage Site. This national park is known not only for its beauty, but also for being a place where people believe in magic and strange things. On March 27, 1998, a blue flash of light and a loud thunderous roar lit up the night sky. Dozens of people in the area and a pilot who was in the air at the time called to tell about the event. The pilot said that the fireball came within 2 miles of his plane and that he saw the temperature in the area rise dramatically. Others who were there at the same time as the pilot agreed with what he said, and officials later said that the blast was caused by nothing more than a meteor. But that doesn't make sense. Some Hawaiians did not believe it. They said that the explosion that so many people saw was proof that the Hawaiian god had woken up and was angry about what people were doing to the world. In fact, a Newswatch report from that day says that this bright light is a rare treat for night owls. People on the island who were awake at 2:41 a.m. today got to see a beautiful light show in the sky. Peter McCotter, who works at the Bishop Museum Planetarium, and missed it because he was sleeping, said, "I wish I had seen it. It was probably something you'd only see once in your life." But what was it? Based on what people who saw it and called the planetarium said, McCord thinks it might have been a fireball or a bright meteor. On the other hand, he said, it could have been a piece of space junk, like a broken satellite or a rocket part that had been thrown away. It's not easy to say. People did see different colors, though, because it was so bright. Because different metals are used in spacecraft, this is sometimes a sign of space junk. Now, police dispatchers on Oahu, Maui, the Big Island, planetarium security guards, and radio stations have all gotten a lot of calls about the mysterious light. On Oahu, the light was described as bluish purple, and on the big island, where the most calls came in from all districts, police the lie made the night sky as bright as day. Even the Coast Guard said it looked like a big meteor going up into the sky. Meteors are pieces of the sun that sometimes fall to Earth. But it's pretty rare for the average person to look up and see one happen right above them. This is one of many strange things that have happened on the island of Hawaii because tourists have taken rocks from Hawaii Volcanoes National Park and then sent them back. They sent them back and said that strange things happened when they got home with the rocks. People thought they were cursed because they took rocks from their home. Others have said that while exploring the island late at night, they ran into ghosts and saw a mysterious mist in the distance. Story was sent to me by a hiker who didn't give his name. He and his girlfriend went hiking up to Yosemite Falls years ago. Before this happened, they didn't really believe in things like Sasquatch, they write, or anything else like that. And he says that it has really made him think. He wrote that he is 24 years old, grew up in a strict Catholic home, has always been a strong believer in the church, and has always had very high moral standards. So he didn't do drugs or drink when he was growing up, and he can vouch for people being honest. So, he went on to tell me exactly what had happened and how it had happened. He said that the day had started out like any other day. He was hiking with his girlfriend in Yosemite Falls. He had been there many times before, so he felt like he knew the area well. This happened on the Upper Falls Trail near where Snow Creek meets the Upper Falls Trail. It was a clear day, not too hot, and the sun was out. It wasn't raining or anything like that, but it had rained before. At this time, there was no one else on the trail or around them. It was around 4:30 p.m. And as he and his girlfriend came down this part of the path, which he said went down by about 5 feet, they heard a piercing scream from about 100 feet to their left. He said it sounded like a deep, guttural roar coming from inside someone's chest. It was so loud and sharp that his girlfriend dropped her water bottle, and it shook their chests. Both of them were startled, and they looked around quickly to see what it was. It was standing in the distance, where the land dips down a bit behind or next to a tree. Both of them are shocked to see what looks like a big man standing there, but it's all black. The hiker went on to say that he is about 61 years old and his girlfriend is about 55 years old, but he could already tell that they were at a huge disadvantage in this situation. I mean, this thing is at least 8 feet tall, probably more. I mean that it's huge. Think about Arnold Schwarzenegger if he were 3 feet taller and wider. And you'd be about right, based on what he and his girlfriend know about the person and whether or not they were fully dressed or thick like a bear with nothing on. From where I was standing and how the light was shining, the forest looked reddish-brown. It was matted and looked kind of gross. It hadn't been brushed at all and was very untidy, but you could still tell from a distance that they were at that. It was very muscular, with a big chest, big pectoral muscles, big biceps, big shoulders, and long arms that looked like the number 8. Its head was big and toned, and I didn't see a neck. Basically, it was like this. He went on to say that because of where the sun was in the sky, they couldn't see the face very well. In relation to where this thing was standing. Now, as soon as this hiker and his girlfriend looked, they were scared when they saw it, so they turned around and went the other way down the trail. He's not sure if it was something he or his girlfriend did. This thing started yelling at them, but they know deep down that it was probably a Sasquatch of some kind. It could have been territorial or aggressive, and it didn't like that they were there for whatever reason. It may have shown itself because they were the only ones in the area that could be seen. But no matter what happened in this case, it made the person who told the story believe that Bigfoot or Sasquatch, or whatever you call him, is real and can be scary when threatened. Was it the flu or a curse that killed off the Hani? Explorers found that anyone who stayed overnight in the ruins of Nabani settlements got a mysterious illness that was very contagious. And according to a DNA legend, this could have been caused by the most feared of all great spirits, Soni, who spread disease with the help of demons who lived in the Hani Valley. Sonita is not the only dangerous thing here, though. An indigenous belief. The whole area has ghosts. Some spirits were helpful, but most of them were harmful. Lesser powers lived in every animal, plant, rock, and other feature of the valley. They could do a lot of damage to anyone who messed with their environment. There were a lot of DNA hunters who went to know Hani and never came back. Bad medicine. Others found that the trails of the animals they tracked cemented as if their quarry vanished into thin air or were swallowed by the earth itself. Many still believe that these spirits and the curses they created cling to the Nabani Valley, the source of its many deaths and disappearances. One notable spirit dwells in the caves along the South Nabani River. According to tribal lore, it is known for making people disappear like smoke in the wind. Its hideous wails can be heard drifting on the breeze at night. While on an expedition to know Hani, journalist Pierre Burton experienced this sound firsthand. He described a low howling wind that swept out of the mountain down into the valley, died and rose again in greater intensity. The banshee wail made our hackles rise, for this was without a doubt the spirit sound so many men talked and whispered about. Even when this sound isn't heard, an oppressive feeling hovers over Nabani Frank. Henderson said in the 1940s that there's absolutely no denying the sinister atmosphere of the whole valley. Depending on the legend, the park's eerie landmarks, including its many caves and thin spires of rock called hoodoos, either housed, attracted, or were created by these spirits themselves. These spirits sometimes make themselves explicitly known. In July of 2010, Anthony Roche, a Parks Canada employee of Indigenous descent, was preparing for winter and Hani by clearing trails and collecting firewood for the warden's cabin, although no tourists were allowed in this portion of the park at the time due to the forest fires. He found companionship in two other employees, Bob and Amy, who eventually joined him at the cabin one day. Anthony and Bob dozed off in their bunk beds while Amy washed dishes in the kitchen. After a time, Anthony heard her stop. Everything fell silent in the cabin, and a short time later Anthony became aware of someone, presumably Amy, walking from the kitchen into the bunk room. The presence tapped him on his heel. Anthony grumbled a reply, assuming Amy wanted him to finish the dishes. He dozed off only to be briefly awoken again by a light shake on the shoulder. Finally the footsteps angrily stomped back into the bunk room and Anthony was forcefully shaken awake. The footsteps stormed out of the room before he opened his eyes, and when he looked there was nobody there. After using the outhouse, Anthony returned to the cabin only to find Amy herself asleep on the couch. When he woke her up, she denied ever entering the bunk room. Bob said that he had been asleep the entire time as well. Even if he was lying, Bob had been on the top bunk and there was no way he could have climbed down without Anthony noticing. A month later, Anthony was helping a student and other co-workers film a promotional video for No Hani. At one point they were alarmed by a strange call from the forest. It sounded like a raven but was clearly a human being imitating a raven. Tourists were still restricted in the area, and Anthony looked to one of the senior park employees for an answer. His companion only cryptically replied, "He's just letting us know he's there." Within moments, the wind picked up, carrying the unmistakable sound of a woman singing. This time, none of Anthony's co-workers could offer any explanation, other than that they all agreed it sounded exactly like singing. In fact, Timothy John Barnes, who's only 25 years old, is a lot like Joel Thompson in the sense where he just disappeared. Timothy John Barnes had been a resident of Cucamonga, California in 1988. Timothy had left Tunisia Lakes right near Highway 120 East, to take Yoga Road in California. This was approximately at 9 in the morning on July 5, 1988. Timothy had this plan to hike from the Murphy Creek trailhead all the way to Polydome Lakes in Yosemite National Park. The location is approximately 3 miles, give or take, from Tunisia Lakes. But like many other hikers who promised they'll be back, he never showed up, and was never seen from again. Now, if we look specifically at these kinds of disappearances, it's very possible that there is a human trafficking element, which I'm 100% sure does happen. But how do you account for the hundreds, if not thousands of people that go reporting under strange circumstances like this? I mean, these people don't just disappear, they literally disappear without a trace of anybody ever seeing them again. And if we think critically, to smuggle someone or to kidnap them, you would have to do it very clandestinely without anybody else, including other hikers, campers or park personnel, seeing you at all. And a lot of times these people go missing off in the middle of nowhere, albeit they're still on a well-known trail. But still, it just seems highly unlikely. Timothy's friends at the time had reported him missing to the park personnel and a search and rescue service, and they began an extensive search the following day. But even that failed to produce any evidence to his potential whereabouts. And finally, on July 19, 1992, he was legally declared dead after years of his disappearance, and his remains have never been found, and 30 years later since his declaration of death. Well, almost about 30 years, there has still been no trace of him ever to be found, and his family, like many other of the missing persons, will never have that closure, at least for the time being. The first strange thing that really stood out to me is the tree that is known as the Old Man. This is probably the best documented thing that can suggest that just maybe there is something truly strange going on in Crater Lake. The Old Man is a 30-foot hemlock tree that floats upright in Crater Lake with about 3 foot showing above the surface. Carbon dating estimates the tree to be over 450 years old, and it was first sighted in 1896 by a geologist, Joseph Diller. Many things about this tree are strange and odd, to say the least. The first fact is that the tree looks like it is rooted into the lake bed below. However, it moves across the lake in 1938. A group was commissioned to see just how far this tree moves. It was determined that from the month of July to the month of October, that this tree had moved around the lake some 62.7 miles. In fact, on August 6, it was recorded as moving a whopping 3.8 miles. Some people have argued that the wind is blowing the tree around the lake. It has been observed that the Old Man often goes in the direction against the wind. Another thing that has stumped scientists is the fact that this tree has been floating for so long. I couldn't find a definitive answer on how long the process usually takes, but normally, what happens is that a tree floating any body of water will become waterlogged and ultimately will sink over time. The process is usually a lot quicker than 120 years. And for all we know, the Old Man could have been in the lake longer than that. And yet another strange thing about the Old Man is the way it is floating. It is floating in an upright position. Scientists have measured the tree, and according to their calculations, a tree the size of the Old Man should be floating horizontal, not vertical. This has caused scientists to try and develop a hypothesis to explain the abnormal behavior. One theory is that the rocks were attached to the tree's roots when it fell into the lake, and thus has caused the tree to anchor into an upright position. However, there's no evidence to suggest that this is the case, because scientists don't have a definitive answer on why the Old Man floats the way it does. Some have begun to suggest that the Old Man defies known physics. Its origins and floating orientation is not the only weird thing associated with the Old Man. Some people claim that it has the power to alter the very weather around it. The story has been told hundreds of times and goes like this. In the year 1988, a group of scientists was going to conduct a submarine expedition of the lake itself. They view the old man as a safety hazard and decided it would be best to moor in on the eastern shore of Wizard Island. The story goes that the crew had not so much as put the rope around the log, when out of nowhere the sky turned dark and the lake waters suddenly became violent and a nasty storm began to rage. The crew began to panic and untied the tree. The crazy thing is that as soon as the rope was removed, the skies immediately cleared, the one stopped and the weather returned to the blissful new that existed before they had put the rope onto the old man. An interesting note is that, as mentioned earlier in the video, Wizard Island is associated with the Dark Lord Lao. So maybe something is truly going on, whether there would be a dark energy trapped on it or something unexplainable, perhaps something supernatural. I tried to see if there was anything conclusive that would point to this really happening, but I couldn't find any first-hand accounts of this. However, I did find that indeed, a submarine expedition did take place in 1980, and that several park rangers at Crater Lake believe this to be a true story. So much so that they no longer allow people to jump onto the old man and pose for pictures. In fact, one of the more notorious events surrounding the Lake Michigan Triangle is in 1891 a schooner that was named the Thomas Hume had set off across the lake to the other side in search of lumber. And somehow in the midst of traveling from one shore to the other, the ship had disappeared along with its crew of 7 sailors. And with strangers today, with all of our technology and the fact that we can trace things on the bottom of the lake and find wrecked ships, there is zero trace of the ship ever existing, and they cannot find any wreckage of it on the bottom of the lake. But it doesn't end it just there, because in 1921, 11 people inside the Rosabelle ship had also somehow mysteriously vanished without a trace while in the Lake Michigan Triangle. How? However, the ship was later found overturned in the water when they were able to pull the boat ashore and observe it for details or clues to what had happened. The ship appeared to have been in a collision with another ship. However, at the time there was no other ships that had reported an accident or a collision at all, making many scratch their heads and wondering how and why is this possible. But perhaps one of the more disturbing and strange cases of the Lake Michigan Triangle is that George R. Donner. Because on April 28, 1937, Captain Donner had just mysteriously vanished from his ship cabin. The sail was going smooth and everything was normal. The captain alerted his entire crew that he was going to retreat to his quarters to rest, and after doing so, about 3 or so hours later, one of his crew members went into his cabin to report to him, "Captain, we're nearing the ports," and he was nowhere to be found. It would have been impossible for him to sneak off the boat since there were crew everywhere, and someone surely would have seen him if he had jumped off the boat committing suicide somehow. So where did he go? And more importantly, if he did disappear, why did none of the other crew disappear as well? Of course, at the time they searched as thoroughly as they could, but to this day his disappearance remains unsolved. Crater Lake National Park, while stunning, beautiful and serene, hold its own dark mysteries and past, while like many other nash parks is the grounds for many missing persons and strange disappearances, but also a lot of homicides. In the summer of 1979, a David Pennebaker decided to take a job here as a seasonal park ranger. But Dave's interest peaked as he was told by fellow rangers and park personnel about a craft that had shown up there shortly after World War II. A Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter that has somehow managed to crash land into this section of the park but was unable to be retrieved and moved out. So there it laid, just sitting out in the wilderness for anyone to go see if you knew where to go. Even though nature had mostly reclaimed this area where the plane had crashed, part of the White Star insignia could still be made out from the overgrowth surrounding it, and part of its machine gun was now embedded in the side of the cliff. Nobody knew exactly what had happened to the pilot. Most assumed he had either perished in the crash or had parachuted his way out, and nobody knows what became of him. So in pursuit of wanting to see this plane, Dave Pennebaker decided that taking a day off to go and see this plane wreckage would be really cool. So that's exactly what he did. And as he hiked and ventured off into the wilderness, He eventually lost track of where he was trying to find this plane wreckage, and he searched and he searched and he scoured, but eventually he did not find anything, and after some time he realized that he was lost, and if he did not stop and get his bearings, he soon would become another statistic of a missing persons in the park. So that's when this young seasonal park ranger sat on a log and began to really think about what he was doing, where he could go and how he can get himself out of this predicament that he had now found himself in. He still had not found the plane wreckage, and he needed to get out of here. Now when he realized while he was in deep in thought, something was looking at him, something that used to be living. Because right in front of him under a log was the remains of a deceased World War II Hellcat pilot. Of course all that remained was just a skeleton at this point. But immediately you can imagine the dread and nervousness and fear that Dave must have felt, having his eyes fall upon this old cadaver that is years old at this point. David, probably beyond terrified and also intrigued, actually took the skull and was somehow able to find his way back, because later on when he had spoke to his chief ranger, who was not at all happy with him by the way, since he had lost his way and almost became another missing persons. He simply showed his chief ranger the skull, and the chief ranger was astonished when David told his story. They had an entire naval investigation team come out using dental records to identify the person of the skull. The skull had belonged to Ensign Frank Lupo of New Jersey. It is said that Lupo had been part of a squadron of 7 Hellcats flying from Redmond to Red Bluff, California in 1945. All 7 of them had been struggling with visibility in the weather days, since the clouds were much lower than normal, which had made visibility a lot more difficult. As the squadron flew in the ever-lowering fog of clouds that actually got at one point only around 500 feet above the treetops. All the Hellcats had emerged safely except for one. They were missing one of their members, and sent Frank Lupo had somehow probably crashed or something that happened due to complete lack of visibility, and the rest is history, and this story actually has a positive end. As the Navy was able to return Frank's skull to his mother, after 25 years of heartache and heartbreak and a lot of questions, she was finally able to put her son to rest. Jeremy Foyer had worked as a park ranger in Mount Rainier National Park, and around 2014, he lived in the park but mostly stayed at the Sunrise Visitor Center on the weekends. At the time this story takes place, it was around 3:30 in the morning, and Jeremy was driving up a rocky mountain road in a thick fog. His headlights were just bright enough to let him see where he was going. This night, there wasn't much moonlight, and there was a lot to see around him, so he's driving slowly, gripping the wheel, and doing his best to get through this road. And, like most other stories, as he comes around a bend in the mountain road, he sees something that scares him. He sees movement to his right. And at first, he thinks it's a person because it didn't look like an animal when it was on all fours, but rather when it was standing up. As he slows down, he sees this figure stop and get right about to the edge of the road. At the same time, he's coming around a bend, so he could see a figure just out of the dim lighting, but as his headlights came around the bend and started to shine and partially illuminate this figure, now, he said that the creature he saw was no taller than a man, probably around 58 to 5'11", since he's about 5 feet tall, and said it was about the same height as him. He also said that it looked like a person, except that it was very hairy and had a head like a German shepherd or a timber wolf. Then, when it got to the edge of the road, it stopped, turned its head, and looked right into his eyes. This made him stop completely. His mouth is wide open, and he's staring at this thing in complete shock. His brain is trying to figure out what it is, and he could tell right away that it wasn't a person in a werewolf costume coming down the mountain. This looked way too real, and he could see the muscles moving underneath its chest and body. Also, the fur and skin around the chest and biceps were very thin, which meant you could see muscle definition. You could see its chest contract and expand as it breathed, even seeing its hot breath in the cold night air, and its eyes were glowing this ambush yellow color and looking right at him. And as he looks at this thing, his eyes slowly start to move down, and he sees that it has hands, or at least hands that look like hands, with 4 fingers and a thumb. They just had long claws that were 34 inches long. But he said that if there was ever a real werewolf, this was it, even though he knows that's a crazy idea. He said that even though this animal looked like a made-up animal, that's what it was. Or at least he thinks it was an animal that looked like that and almost made him look away. This thing starts to move forward into his headlights and straight toward his car. Now that this is happening, he still has his mouth open in shock, and Jeremy looks and sees that, unlike a dog, this thing has legs like a man, with bent knees, big ankles, and big feet. Jeremy doesn't know what to do because this thing is just casually walking right up to his car. Not only is he confused, but he's also very scared. As soon as he looks down to put the car in reverse, he feels something hit the car. As soon as he looks up, he sees that the thing has moved the short distance in a second and is now putting its hand on the hood of the car and pressing it down while never taking its eyes off of Jeremy's. Jeremy thinks this means that it was trying to be the alpha, the leader, or that it was trying to scare him. It was telling him, "No, you're in my territory, and you should respect it." When Jeremy took his foot off the brake pedal and slowly put it on the gas, his car started to drift down, and when he put it in reverse and tried to speed up to get away from whatever it was, it just stood there with its headlights getting further and further away from the car until it was completely hidden by the fog. As he drove away in reverse, Jeremy started to cry and break down because he was scared and didn't know how to defeat such a strange and scary creature. So, after a few seconds, he realizes that this thing could still be coming toward his car in the fog, and he decides that he has no choice but to drive away. He can't just go backwards all the way down this road. Instead, he has to put his car in drive and drive a little faster, hoping he won't run into the thing that was standing in the middle of the road and blocking his way the last time he saw it. So, he puts the car in drive and hopes for the best. This time, he drives a little bit faster, and he gets to the same spot where he saw the wolf-like creature, but it's nowhere to be found. So he doesn't even bother to look around or see what's going on. He just wants to get off this dirt road and go home. Lucky for Jeremy, nothing bad happened on the way. But now that he is past this point, he is glad that it is over. He sees something in his rearview mirror, so he starts driving, hoping the fog will clear up a bit so he can get down to the road. As he drives, he sees something come out of the fog and run toward his car. But now that he's on all fours, Jeremy is very scared by what he sees in his rearview mirror. He decides to speed up even more, and after a short distance, he's able to get through the fog because it starts to clear up as he goes down a hill. This chase only lasted about 45 seconds. It never caught up to Jeremy's car, but it got very close. Suddenly, along with the fog, the thing disappeared, and now that Jeremy is at a lower altitude, he can't see it anymore. Jeremy was lucky to make it home safely without anything else happening or anything else being seen. At the end of 2014, Jeremy would move to Pennsylvania, where he would keep working as a park ranger for the Forest Service. Since that night, Jeremy Foyer hasn't met anyone else in the same situation. Dylan sent in this first story in August of 2011. Dylan worked as a seasonal park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park at the Deep Creek campground. Around midnight, he left the park to drive back to his house on the other side of it. He had gone this way many times before, and it was usually very dark. On this night, there wasn't much light. But the moon was out and very full, so he could see much better than usual as he drove down Deep Creek Road, which leads south to Bryson City. Something caught his eye up ahead, near some trees and an old picnic table that had been taken away because it was old and rotting. Dylan first thought it might be a bear because there are black bears all over the South, but then he saw how strangely shaped it was compared to a normal black bear, especially when it stood up like this one did. He thought it was about 7 to 8 feet tall and had long, flowing black hair all over its body except for its face, which looked more human than anything else. From where he was standing and how bright it was hard to tell, but its arms were not as big as you would expect for an animal this size. Instead, they were thin and long, with long, bony fingers. Dylan saw it for about 10 seconds before he kept driving. But that was long enough for him to get a creepy feeling in the pit of his stomach and wonder what he had just seen. As soon as he got home, he told his wife what had happened. At first, as usual, she didn't believe him, but after he told her more about what he had seen, she started to believe him. She didn't say Bigfoot or Sasquatch, because she doesn't know much about them, but she thought it was very likely that's what he had seen. Dylan had a hard time accepting and making sense of this for a long time, until he was able to talk to other people who worked in the park who had seen similar things. One of the staff members, who he got to know well while they worked together, told him about some ghosts she had seen while she was working in the park. Dylan realized from this that there are probably more of these kinds of animals in this area than he had ever thought. Since then, he has become a believer and is sure that whatever he saw was probably some kind of Sasquatch. Now, his co-worker told him that the first time she saw a big two-legged creature was in 1997 in the Deep Creek area. She was driving when she saw a big two-legged creature move across the road in front of her car. Since then, she has seen him a few more times in the park and on roads near it. Both places are very close to each other, as is the place where Dylan saw the creature. This makes Dylan even more sure that this is a popular place for these creatures in the area. But the creature he saw was not as big and bulky as the one his co-worker saw. Even though she was taller and thinner, the creature she saw looked more like an ape. While the one he had seen, which was thinner and smaller, looked more human. Dylan and his co-worker have both seen lots of black bears in the area before. Dylan says that as this thing moved across the road in front of him, he didn't hear any sounds. But he also said that the engine and the radio kind of drowned out any other sounds. He also said that the smell of rotten eggs filled the car. It smelled bad, like rotting meat, and urine, as Dylan said. And like what happened to his co-worker in 2005 when she was driving on a similar road in the summer and saw one of these things. In the early evening, she saw a large, upright creature, similar to what she had seen before and what Dylan had seen, standing on its hind legs near a tree next to the road. She said that this one was about 8 feet high. Grey, with a big head, shoulders, and arms but almost no neck. She said that this one was much bigger than the first one and that, based on its shape and size, she thinks the first one she saw was a woman. The way its muscles were defined and the way its body was shaped showed that it was a man. Unlike the first time they met, this one seemed to act aggressively toward her, and she said it even took a few steps toward her car as if it was getting ready to do a bluff charge. She said it was very scary and aggressive at the time, and that it was a very intense situation. Dylan had heard of other sightings in the area since then, but he couldn't think of any right now. There are also reservations for Native American tribes nearby, which are not too far away. They have also reported sightings in that area, and each tribe has its own stories. They might even be the best people to talk to about stories like this one. So, what's your opinion? Dylan and his co-worker really saw something from another planet? Or are these just 3 different names for the same black bear? What do you think would have happened if this singing spirit had gone up to the park workers? They may have lost their minds. Native people told stories about people going crazy after coming out of the Hani Valley. With more recent stories that are backed up by history. For example, bush pilots who went to check on 5 prospectors in 1960 found 2 of them dead and told the pilots what they had seen. They put the pieces together. The prospectors were running out of flowers, and moose and caribou bodies in the park show that they turned to hunting big game in the park. They did not dress the animals, though. Instead, they just left them in the field. Instead, the men killed and ate their own dogs, sometimes waiting until they were so rotten that their skin fell off at the slightest touch. Another prospector ate a caribou's guts but let the rest of the meat rot in the sun, which shows how desperate and crazy they were. One of the men uses the last of their dynamite to kill himself in the middle of the forest. When they heard about this tragedy, 2 prospectors went to get help, but they never came back. This left the last 2 survivors to sit in their cabin and get drunk. A prospector named Joe set up a simple log cabin in a Hani around 1914. A rescue team looking for a missing person in the valley came across him and found his face badly scratched and his eye swollen shut. They asked Joe if he and his prospecting partner Red had been fighting. Joe mumbled something about being left alone and fighting blue devils in the mountains, which he now had locked up. In a box, Joe ran back to his cabin to get a small wooden box and told the people who came to help him to follow him into the woods. They didn't want to do it, but they did. After a while, though, they started to worry that the box was full of gunpowder. The other guys jumped on Joe. They were relieved to see that the only things in the box were matches and baking powder. After a short fight, Joe finally realized who his visitors were. He had met them before they brought him back to the cabin, where they hid his cutlery and bandaged his wounds, which they said he got from falling. Shortly after that, they found Red in the woods. He had run away from Joe because he was crazy. Over the next few weeks, Joe seemed to settle down, and the two of them went prospecting again. But he eventually started making up strange rituals and ended up building an altar for sacrifices on top of a mountain. This was the last thing Red could take, so he took Joe back to civilization to get medical care. Michael Vickery, who was 51, was reported missing after he didn't come back from a 4-day hike. Yes, this happened on June 15, 2005. Michael was already known as an experienced hiker, who loved being outside and going backpacking. And he had gone to the north side of the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir in Yosemite National Park because he wanted to go on a very long solo hike. He had planned to go on this long hike to Rancheria Falls, tilt a mountain to get to Lake Vernon, then go through Beehive and back to the Hetchy Reservoir. Michael was last seen heading north on the Pacific Crest Trail toward Tilted Mountain. This was the last time anyone saw him. No one heard from him again after that. It's as if he just disappeared for no reason. Like the other people we've talked about today, his family was very worried when he didn't come home on June 19th, the day he was supposed to come back from his hike, and the day his permit ran out. So, on June 21st, it was clear that something had happened. His family called the Park Service, and a thorough search of the area around the reservoir and the Pacific Crest Trail began. Fortunately, or I guess semi-fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the search turned up nothing. Even though they couldn't find Michael, they did find what they thought was his backpack. Near Tiltil Mountain, just off the trail, there is a topographical map of a search and rescue operation for Michael involved people from several counties, as well as dogs, airplanes, and anything else they could use to look for him. Other than his backpack, nothing else was ever found or found out about him. And now, in 2022, it has been almost exactly 17 years since Michael disappeared. And there are no bones at all to be found. And, just like the others, this person just disappeared under strange circumstances. Yellowstone also had a problem with people who ate each other. At one point, you see that on July 11, 1970, police got a call from a worried fisherman near Gardner, Montana, which is the only entrance to Yellowstone National Park that is open all year. The man said he was fishing on the Yellowstone River when he caught something he wasn't expecting, a dead body. The officer who works at the entrance to Yellowstone, a deputy named Bigelow, came to help. He and a few other volunteers got into the water and pulled the headless body out of the water. Bigelow knew a murder when he saw one, and the coroner and sheriff of the county were there quickly. The person who was hurt was a man who was only wearing shorts. His legs were being cut off at the knees, and his arms were also being cut off at the shoulders. The torso had 27 separate stab wounds, and his chest had a big hole in it. Stranger still, there was no heart. None of the missing body parts were ever found, and authorities soon thought they might have found the remains of a 22-year-old man who had been reported missing. James Slogger told people he was going to Yellowstone National Park, but he didn't show up to work on a Monday. 2 days later, and more than 1,100 miles away, near the Big Sur, California Highway Patrol officers responded to a hit-and-run accident. They eventually found and caught one of the suspects, who immediately told them what had happened. He said, "I have a problem, and as proof, I am a cannibal." Both men took out the human finger bones from their pockets. Stanley Dean Baker was the main suspect. During his questioning, Baker said that he had hitchhiked alone near Yellowstone National Park and was picked up by a man in an Opel Kadett sports car. Baker said that Schlosser told him he was going to Yellowstone and invited him to camp with him that night. When it got dark, Baker said, he shot Schlosser twice in the head and then took care of the body. He ate the man's heart raw and saved his fingers to eat later. Schlosser's body was thrown into the Yellowstone River, and Baker used his car to get to California. He had also picked up another hitchhiker along the way, who he swore had nothing to do with the murder. Law enforcement found evidence that backed up Baker's story when they went to the site where he had apparently camped with Schlosser. They found dried blood patches, a bloody hunting knife, and more pieces of the victim, like bones, teeth, skin, and even an ear. As if this story wasn't dark enough, Baker said he ate people because he was in a long-term relationship with satanic cults that recruited him from a college campus in his hometown in Wyoming. He also said he was part of the mysterious 4-Pi movement, which he said was started by a wealthy businessman in California. In 1967, the 4-Pi movement was often blamed for the ritualistic deaths of both animals and people all over California. Baker said he had first-hand knowledge of multiple human sacrifices, some of which he had done himself, all in the name of the cult's leader, who called himself the Grand Shingain. There are signs that Baker may have killed another man as well. Robert Salem is a lighting designer in San Francisco. Schlosser Baker told police that he and his fellow cultists would eat their victims' flesh and drink their blood as part of a satanic ritual. This was a few months before he started eating people. Baker showed off several tattoos that showed he was a member of the cults as more proof of his involvement. When he was caught, Baker had LSD and a satanic Bible on him. He would later say that his belief in the devil wasn't as much of a reason for his murderous actions as the drugs were. In any case, both Baker and his traveling partner were sent to prison. The latter was sentenced to 10 years but released into Baker, on the other hand, received a life sentence despite claiming that his odd behavior was drug-induced. Baker continued to act erratically in prison. He tried to hurt the guards and was once caught with a weapon he had made himself. At least 11 times, he allegedly kept trying to get other inmates to join the cults. Baker also said he was Jesus Christ and that Jimi Hendrix did not die from a drug overdose. He had actually killed the rock star with his mind while he was in a prison cell in Montana. Even though what Baker did was very bad, he was let out of prison in December 1986 because he had changed enough to be able to rejoin society. He moved to a small town, where he is said to have become a top salesman at a sporting goods store. He died in Minnesota in 1990 of liver cancer. Travis's story goes all the way back to 2015, when he was hiking in the Appalachian Mountains. He had planned to go camping by himself in the backcountry, but he didn't do it because he couldn't find a good spot. So he still just wanted to go to the trailhead, and start walking around to see what he could find. Maybe he can set up a makeshift campsite with just his small tent and stay for a night or two instead of the week he had planned. The weather was perfect, with light winds and temperatures around 50 degrees and partly cloudy, so he could have a nice camping trip. At this point, he had probably been hiking for about 3 hours and hadn't seen anyone else on the trail he was on. This wasn't that unusual for the area, though, since the farther out on this trail you go, the more isolated it gets from people. As he keeps walking along the trail, he notices something very strange about the forest. Everything around him has become very quiet, except for the sound of his own feet crunching over sticks and leaves. And it's interesting that this part of the trail is thick with underbrush on both sides, and he can usually hear birds singing and other animals making noise all morning long. It seemed like they all ran away or just disappeared, and the further he went into the woods, the stranger things got and the more the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, making him think something was wrong. And the more he thought about it, the more he thought that every living thing must have left this part of nature like rats leaving a ship that is sinking. At this point, he's probably been hiking for close to 4 hours, and he's been hearing a strange, creepy silence. Probably a little over an hour. At this point, he comes to an opening where he can see a small, flat area about 30 yards wide. On each side of the trail, where the trail used to be, there were rock outcroppings. From where he was standing, he could see what looked like a large black dog crouching on the ground behind some of these outcroppings, as if it were kneeling down to do something. He keeps climbing up towards this opening, trying to figure out what he's looking at but can't, and realizes as he gets closer that what he's seeing is a wolf. But he's trying to understand that no, this isn't a wolf because we don't have black wolves this large, and he noticed the way it was sitting and crouching was strange. And as Travis got closer and closer to it, it stopped what it was doing and turned its head to look right at him. Travis immediately felt scared because this thing was staring right at him. His words is that this thing had these glowing yellow eyes and blood all over its muzzle. So it was clear that it had eaten something. So Travis stopped staring at this thing. It's staring back at him, and he can see that it looks like a very large, all-black timber wolf, but it doesn't make sense to him what he's looking at. So he thinks, is this just a big black bear? Am I just not seeing this right? Or the shadows are making it hard for me to see what I'm looking at? Then it just turns its head away from him, showing that it doesn't care about Travis at all, and goes back to what Travis thinks is tearing and ripping at the dead animal it's eating. But Travis stops in his tracks and realizes that no matter what he's looking at, something doesn't feel right. He also notices that all the noises around him have stopped, which only happens when a big predator is nearby, and his instincts are telling him to leave. Things are not what they seem to be right now. So he stops and keeps looking at whatever it is he's looking at, trying to convince himself that it's probably just a mutated black bear or something. He starts to move backwards slowly, hoping that it won't turn its head again. But as he's going backwards, the thing stops again and looks back at him. This time, Travis said, it was by far the scariest moment because what he thought was a big timber wolf was no longer a timber wolf at all. It then stood up on 2 legs like a man and didn't move strangely or have trouble keeping its balance. Now, it's pretty common for black bears to stand up on their own, but the way this thing moved its gait and the way its bones were set up had nothing to do with a black bear. Travis has seen many black bears over the course of his life. And this was definitely not it. This was more like a bodybuilder with a tapered waist, clearly defined dog legs with hawks, and a very large chest with bulging pecs and biceps. And this thing's face looked like it was mad at Travis for even trying to get in the way of its meal time. So, he said, it slowly started moving toward him. That's when Travis decided to run, not even caring at this point if running away from a natural predator would make it chase a prey animal. He decided to run away for about 20 minutes, when he was finally able to rest. He noticed that the area around him was still very quiet, and it seemed like all the animals had left. Travis didn't see any signs of this big animal that looked like a wolf, but he did feel like he was being watched the whole way back down this trail and all the way to his car, which lasted the rest of the day. So he thinks that at least this creature or another one of them was following him and that the sounds he heard in the woods never came back the rest of that day. Even on his way back to his car, he passed several groups of hikers going down the trail, but he didn't tell any of them what he had seen or heard. They also didn't seem to be aware of the lack of sounds around them, which should have been a huge warning sign for everyone. Travis went on to say that he had a second experience that was even scarier. In July 2018, he went to a friend's property in eastern Pennsylvania, which is still in the Appalachian Mountains. Travis's friend's property is out in the middle of nowhere, so it took him about 40 minutes to get there. His friend has a stable for his horses and a lot of open fields. He has a small house, but it's surrounded by a lot of land and acreage, and his closest neighbor is at least a mile away. He lives in the middle of nowhere, and Travis stayed with a friend who was scared by something they couldn't explain. So he went to his friend's house on a Friday night, and they stayed up until 1 or 2 a.m. drinking by his fire pit and talking about funny memories from the past, as friends do. When it was time to go inside for the night, Travis and his friend heard a strange scream coming from the horse stables. When he and his friend went outside, they found one of the horses dead on the side of the stables. They could see that something with a lot of strength had torn the stable door off, gone in, ripped the door off, and cut the horse's throat open, then left within 2 minutes, which was how long it took them to leave the house and get to the stables. Travis and his friend both felt like they were being watched, but more importantly, they both felt like a large predator was following them. They both thought it was a mountain lion. But Travis and his friend are now looking down at this dead horse, which just died, and all the other horses, which are so scared and panicked that they are shaking. The cuts on this horse were way too big to have been made by a cougar. Just then, they heard a loud crash that sounded like a small tree being pulled out of the ground. It was probably about 30 feet away in the yards to the east, which is on the other side of the stables. Travis and his friend turned their light and attention to the east, where they can clearly see out of the stables into the woods. They see 2 glowing yellow eyes looking back at them. The light from the eyes shines back at them. And what Travis and his friends see makes them all very scared. Well, they can't really see what they're looking at in detail, but they can see that whatever it was huge, at least 8 feet off the ground, with a huge head that looked like a dog's head holding on to one of the branches and staring in that direction without asking any questions because they didn't want to shoot an unprovoked predator. At that point, they both go back to the house, lock the doors, and get their guns. They are now ready to fight. Now, for the rest of the night, they could hear this thing crashing and screaming in the woods near the house. Sometimes it would even come up to the porch and try to pry open the door. Travis and his best friend are scared to death, and Travis is immediately reminded of the strange creature he saw in the Appalachian Mountains 2 years ago. At one point during the morning, the creature was looking at them through the windows, and Travis and his friend said it looked like something from hell. Before the sun came up, this thing spent the rest of the early morning going around the house, scratching the side, making horrible noises and screams, and almost trying to break in, but never did. So Travis and his friend thought that whatever it was had never tried to break into the house to begin with. No, these were all very smart ways to make people scared and intimidated. Travis and his friend saw something that they both think was completely evil. Travis said that the creature he saw in the Appalachian Mountains 2 years ago looked a little different than this one, and that the one he and his friends saw looked much more evil, strange, and big. It was also pitch black, so black that it absorbed the light around it. Travis thought that he might have been the one who brought this animal up here. not literally, but his friend had been living here for at least 3 years at this point and had never had any problems. Travis had never been to this place before, and the one night he was there, this thing showed up out of the blue. So, that thing from the mountains might have stuck to him or be drawn to him or something, but it doesn't make sense. And when morning came, there didn't seem to be any signs of this thing anymore. Travis and his friend thought it was safe to go outside and check on his animals and other horses to make sure they were all right. Even though the rest of his animals and horses were scared, frightened, and on edge, only that one horse in the stable had died. They couldn't get to it because the thing had been out there all night. His friend was very scared and didn't know what had happened the night before. He couldn't even talk about it because he didn't know what to tell the police if he called them. So he just decided that a big mountain lion had tried to attack his horse and succeeded. Travis thought that whatever it was that he saw in the mountains 2 years ago had attached itself to him or marked him in some way so that it would follow him out here in eastern Pennsylvania. That's just his theory, and he doesn't have any proof to back it up, but he doesn't know why out of the blue. This thing seems to happen the first night he goes to his friend's house. After a few weeks, he checks in with his friend, who says he hasn't had any more strange things happen since then. One night, everything was back to normal and everything was quiet. It seems like the animals' fear level went down after Travis left and everything went back to normal. Of course, the friend buried his horse, and he has no idea how to explain the almost supernatural things that happened that same night. Is Travis telling the truth, or did his friend really meet a supernatural alpha predator in the deep woods? Glenn sent us our last story, which is about Spruce Flats Falls, a rocky hiking area around a forested mountain creek that has a waterfall with a swimming hole. This will happen in the fall of 2019. He was hiking with his dog and a friend who is also a good hiker. They were about a quarter mile from the road on the Spruce Flats Falls Trail. They have hiked that trail many times and know it well. About a quarter mile from the Upper Tremont Road, there is a creek crossing. The path goes over the creek and then follows the creek up the hill for a while. They were on this part of the trail when they noticed something. As they walked around the edges of the trees, they started to feel a sort of electrical charge in the air, like when you get close to a big power station or a charged radio antenna. Glenn has worked in radio and electronics for a long time and knows a lot about them. So, they both understood what it was. They both felt this strange electrical charge, but it was strongest near the trees in the creek. They also smelled something very bad, almost like rotten eggs. They had smelled this smell in the forest before, so they knew what it was. It smelled like nothing else. They had also noticed that all of the birds and bugs were quiet. No crickets or frogs that make noise. Glenn's friend and he both looked at each other and said, "Something doesn't seem right here," with their faces. They kept walking up the trail, but they did it very slowly, as if they were waiting for something or wading through water. They felt like they couldn't move as quickly as usual, and even their dog was still and unusually quiet, as if he were frozen or moving at a slow pace. As they kept looking around in front of them, they saw that the trees were now swaying as if the wind were blowing them, but there was no wind and they couldn't figure out why. As they got closer, they figured out where the smell and electric charge were coming from and saw that the trees above them were moving. As if what he said was camouflage was moving up to the trees, going down, and jumping into the river, they stopped moving and looked up into some very tall trees. They could see that the big branches were not moving, but that something was shaking them. It was almost like a flash of something big moving from branch to branch, shaking the trees, and then darting down into the creek. Both of them had had enough at that point, so they turned around and headed back down the trail. As they got closer to the creek, they took their time and noticed that there was something in the water that wasn't there before. There were some rocks in the way, but they could still see this clear thing floating in the water. It was about 4 to 5 feet long and had a very clear long shape. Glenn and his friend have seen many animals in the wild, including bears, but this was nothing like a bear or any other animal they had seen before. It looked like it had a head, but it wasn't clear enough what it was. It looked like it had a body that tapered into a head, and they couldn't really tell what color it was because it was kind of see-through. However, it looked like it had scales or something on top of its body. Then it started to change color and got very dark. Slowly, it started to rise out of the water and get darker and more solid. Glenn knows this sounds crazy, but he swears it looked like some kind of mantis creature and was very tall and thin. It looked more like the front legs of a praying mantis than it did like it had elbows on its arms. They were very long, and some of them were still in the water. Right away, his fight or flight response kicked in, but he couldn't move. The shark's head, which looked like it was taking shape, turned to look at him and his friend. It stayed perfectly still in the water, but its arms started to move very slowly back and forth, and neither he nor his friend could look away. Now that it was fully out of the water, this thing was looking at Glenn and his friend, almost like a cat would look at a mouse it's about to eat. Immediately, his muscles felt numb and tight, and whatever it was that was buzzing all over his body and making him nervous had temporarily stopped his muscles from moving. He felt like he was going to throw up and became very lightheaded and dizzy. He couldn't move, and his friend said the same thing. Slowly, though, it started to rise out of the water, moving its arms back and forth. Now he could see that the front arms were very long, but they were also slightly bent. Now, it was very dark, almost black. He couldn't see a mouth, but his golden eyes were big and bulging, and he was clearly looking at them. Its head stayed still, but its body moved very slowly forward, almost like it was changing shape as it moved. He said that it made him think of a camera that takes pictures at 120 frames per second, where the motion is very slow and smooth. He kept looking at it, and the more he did, the more he said it looked like a praying mantis. As it moved toward them, it slowly turned clear again, to the point where it disappeared into nothing as it got closer. As soon as it was completely clear again, the electrical disturbances around the body stopped, and Glenn and his friend could move again. So they turned around and ran all the way back to the car. They had never been so scared before. They've both seen a lot of animals in the wild, but this one was different. It looked horrible, and he thinks it was either hiding or doing something similar. He has also seen UFOs, and he thinks this was some kind of mantis being. He doesn't know what it was doing there, but it seemed very interested in Glenn and his friend. He doesn't know why it didn't seem aggressive, just very curious and almost like it was studying him. He knows that this area is also a place where cryptids, ghosts, and Bigfoot are often seen, and he wonders if there is a link between them. Glenn is a very experienced outdoorsman and hunter. Other than a couple of his friends, he knows the woods, mountains, and animals better than anyone else he knows. But this one has stumped Glenn. He has seen a lot of things in the wild, but this one has given him more questions and no answers. So, what did you all think about today's show? Please tell me what you think in the comments below. Are all of these scary stories based on real events, or are they all just works of fiction? And if you like this video, don't forget to click like, and if you want to make sure you never miss an episode, click subscribe down below. I give up every day, from Monday to Sunday. As always guys, keep an open mind. I love all of you, and I'll see you in the next episode. If you liked today's episode, hit the like button and leave a comment below. Tell me what you think and how you feel. And as always, guys, if you're new to the channel, make sure to hit the subscribe button and keep your notifications on, as YouTube will let you know every time or at least a great new video comes out. I love you all. Don't close your minds, and I'll see you in the next video.